Hello, good evening. How are you? It's Thursday, the 16th of September. It's 6 p.m. and it's Pensions Awareness Live. Let's hear from everybody from behind the scenes. Louder than that, Johnny. Come on. Okay, such a fantastic day today. Thank you so much to Now Pensions for taking over the whole day. This is our 5th broadcast today, and it's the one we're all so most excited about. So I just want to say a big thanks to Now Pensions, because without their sponsorship and support, we wouldn't have this event, which is a public event. It's a public awareness effort, and it's been going live all week, and it's got all of tomorrow to run as well. This is a 40-minute roundtable chat, and the subject is It's Time for Women's Pension Power. So enough from me, and I'm going to hand across to senior money reporter from the Times and the Sunday Times, Kate Palmer.
Thank you. This evening we're going to be talking about the gender pensions gap, which I just feel isn't talked about enough compared with, say, the gender pay gap, but it still leads to huge inequalities. So I'm really excited to be able to just talk about this issue, and we can share our personal experiences and see if we can come up with some solutions as well. So shall I leave it to the panel to introduce themselves, perhaps starting with Helen?
Hello, good evening everybody. My name's Helen Westwood. I'm a financial studies teacher who received the 2019 Moneywise Personal Finance Teacher of the Year award. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you. And Eleanor?
Hi everyone, I'm Ellie and I work for Now Pensions as their Director of Marketing Communications.
And Daisy?
Hi, I'm Daisy Lowe, and I am a model, and I'm here just to learn lots about pensions.
Oh, lovely. And Deborah?
Hi everyone, I'm Deborah Joseph. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Glamour, and I'm also excited to hopefully learn and chat all things finance and pensions.
Well, for a start, I would really like to know, if I told each of you that the average pension pot for women is just a third the size of the average man's, what would you say? Daisy, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I had absolutely no idea. When I read that statistic, I was absolutely gobsmacked. It's disgusting and not talked about enough. You know, there's no awareness about it. So how can there be change if no one knows it's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's twice the size of the gender pay gap for full-time employees, just to put that into perspective. Ellie, what are your thoughts?
So obviously it's now pensions research, and honestly, when we first did it, I was incredibly shocked, and I've talked about it all day today, and every time I hear it, I'm equally shocked, just like you, Daisy, really disappointed. You know, I'm a working mum myself. I took maternity leave, and that affected my pension, and to be honest, I kind of sleepwalked into that. And I think a lot of mothers out there would probably say the same, because they just, you know, you're pregnant and you're thinking about things like, you know, what pram and how you're going to get through the night looking after this little thing, and you're not really thinking about the bigger picture. But it's actually super important for yourself and your family later in life.
Deborah, is that something that resonates with you as well?
Oh God, I completely agree with you, Eleanor. I mean, actually, I wasn't that shocked at all by that statistic. It kind of just reconfirmed what I think about women, money and pensions, which is that we're not educated enough about it. We're not taught enough about it in school. Women don't talk about money generally, so it's not something I would discuss with my friends. Like, have you got a pension? Have you not got a pension? And, you know, my pensions have just really relied on who I'm employed by. And the same with you. When I had children, I went freelance for a few years. I didn't have an employer paying into a pension. So yeah, that was my pension gap, those 7 or 8 years that I wasn't with an employer who was paying a pension.
And what do you think, Helen?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I did expect, sadly, that there would be a gap in terms of pension. I think it's really difficult for women who might want to take a break in terms of their working life, whether it's caring for children or maybe aging family members. So I wasn't surprised. I was slightly shocked by the sort of the difference, but I think because women aren't more likely to take those breaks, again, like we've said, I think it's so important that you know, women are empowered with education about the impact of those career breaks. And like you've said, you've got so much to think about when you're a new mother. But actually, when you're making those decisions about your working life after you've had children, but even with that information, maybe finances or the time that you might have, depending on your sort of time away from a full-time work, it still might be quite difficult to fill the gap. So I think that's a real barrier. I mean, part of my decision to work part-time after my daughter was born, I did weigh up the impact on my pension. But I think even with that information, I still would have wanted to make the same decision. So it's really hard if you want to spend time with your children and needing that career break. As I say, I think it is a real big potential barrier for women.
It's tricky. It's almost as if you should start thinking about it in your 20s before you've had children, and think about trying to put away as much money as possible, knowing that you're going to potentially have these career gaps or go into part-time work later in life. And it sounds like it's a common theme that pensions aren't really sort of spoken about much in sort of groups of friends or with your employer. How much have each of you engaged with or spoken about your pension with others until now? Ellie, I imagine you must have spoken about it a lot being part of your job.
Do you know what? It's funny actually, because I'm kind of pre-COVID, everybody. I was a little bit of a kind of weirdo on public transport, not flashing or anything. But you know, when I sort of sit down next to somebody on the bus or on the train, I kind of tend to sort of start talking to them about their life story, and you know, my job comes up and pensions comes up, and I've actually had several conversations about pensions and savings with people, strangers, and I've been really kind of encouraged by what they've said to me, and you guys have all touched on it. They just didn't know. So they know, you know, they've got several pots around, and they know that they think their employer's paying something in, they think they might be paying something in, but they couldn't tell you know, where they were, how much money they had in. We'd talk about what they wanted in the future, and people seem to have a very clear idea of what kind of retirement they might want, and it might be like their parents, but they have no idea what they need to do to get there. So there's that kind of, it's kind of back to that education point, and kind of, and Deborah mentioned it, just talking about money and finances and just getting it out on the table as early as possible.
I see. Okay. And Daisy, is it something that ever comes up in conversation with friends or your family, perhaps?
Not at all. I mean, I've spoken about it with my grandmother before, because I'm self-employed, so I've never had anyone to pay into a pension plan for me. And she seems to be the only person that wants to try and teach me about money. But actually, it wasn't until I was asked to take part in this panel that I started saying to my friends, you know, have you got a pension? Have you ever thought about one? And none of my friends have at all. I think everyone was self-employed, but it was really shocking. It was like all of us, everyone just said, right, well, when you do this talk, can you find out how we do it? Give us the step-by-step guide, because it's not taught. I feel like it should be taught at schools. I mean, I feel like there should be a way of, you know, learning about mortgages and learning how to manage your finances and paying bills, and you know, council tax and pensions being a really big part of that, because at the end of your working life, you deserve that time, you know.
Of course. And Helen, do you think that the nuts and bolts of just setting up a pension, if you're self-employed and not lucky enough to have a company do it all for you, is that being taught in schools at the moment? Do you think that there's more that could be done just to teach people the basics, which actually can seem really daunting at first?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in terms of sort of my approach to financial education, it sort of starts right with what people want to achieve over their sort of personal life cycle, and then moving into actually, well, how do we go about putting those financial products in place? And I've actually shared often with students, I can remember sitting down with my pension form when I started my first job, and well, what age do I want to retire at? And I sort of remember sort of looking around the office and picking a figure without sort of going through any of the thought process of, you know, what might I need to do in terms of contributions to achieve that. So I definitely think there's more that should be done. I mean, finance is such a wide area. I'd say in terms of the teaching that I do, while I might not actually go through the specifics of filling out an initial form, I certainly like to address and open up the questions to students about how they visualize their retirement. In fact, I talked about it this week with a group of 16, 17-year-olds, and I know I always say to them, it's quite difficult to picture that further down the life cycle, but it's so important if you want to have the retirement that you're imagining. You know, how are you going to plan to achieve that? And some teenagers can have really clear ideas at the age they'd like to retire, but when I give them the question, well, how are you going to achieve that? They're the sort of grey areas where the financial education really comes into play.
Yeah, I think we're all guilty of having unrealistic expectations at times. And Deborah, I'd love to know how you think your readers are engaged with pensions. Obviously, lots of millennials and Gen Z readers who maybe might not be thinking about pensions so much and think perhaps that it's a little bit boring and technical. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't think it's just my readers. I think it's women in general. I mean, certainly when we discuss, you know, we don't discuss money. My generation, I'm 46, we don't discuss our salaries, we don't discuss money. And actually, I've been quite pleased to see that my millennial and Gen Z staff actually do much more than I ever did. They discuss their salaries with their friends, with their work colleagues. It was a taboo for me. You just never told anybody what you were earning, or if you were saving, or if you could afford a place or not. It just wasn't a conversation. You kept it quiet. It was inappropriate. I don't know why. It was a taboo. And I think that's, you know, that leads into so many different areas. You're too scared to ask for a pay rise. You're too scared to sometimes even ask for payment. I think women are still expected to work for free sometimes in a way I don't think anyone would ever ask a man to work for free. I've had it myself. And I think all of this kind of conversation around money needs to change and open up. And we launched recently actually a financial Facebook group at Glamour to talk about money, and columns talking about pensions for this exact reason, because I think the next generation of women know that, you know, talking about money is empowering them, and managing your money is empowerment. It's feminist. Money is a feminist issue. And if we don't start talking about pensions, don't start talking about our finances and savings, then we're the ones who are going to lose out in the long run. So I do think there's a bit of a shift towards it actually with the younger generation. I'm not saying they know how to do it because they weren't taught in school either, but I just don't think that there's the same taboo for 20-somethings as there was for my generation. I welcome that.
Can I just jump in at that point and say one of the things within the financial education lessons that I try and establish really early on is to encourage and sort of coach my students to sort of, you know, go out, go home, sort of talk to friends and family about money, but also to explain to them that it is a really sensitive subject. And particularly if we started talking about the impact of issues such as redundancies or issues around things like life assurance, to just be aware of sort of the personal issues around that. But just like Deborah was saying, I think there has been this real reluctance to speak about money, and it has been something that people have shied away from. But actually, I think it's really important for young people to be able to go out and discuss. And I think there is a sort of a more of a readiness, as we are a lot more open about a range of personal topics now. And I hope that we are going to see some sort of movement towards approaching money, maybe like we do with some other subjects, and not seeing it as such a taboo or awkward subject anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Even the last few months have taught us to be much more open about our money worries, because everyone's concerned at the moment, whether it's to do with being furloughed or worrying about their jobs. And actually, one positive is that we can just talk about conversations which previously we might have seen as quite awkward to address and not want to talk about with family and friends. I actually just wanted to ask the mothers in the room how they feel that motherhood and family life has affected their pensions. Deborah, do you have a daughter?
I've got 3 children actually. I've got
3 children.
Yes. Well, I think look, in my 20s, I remember I was asked, do I want a pension at work? And I don't think I took it. I said no. And I think the reason, I remember I was about 21, 22 years old. I remember thinking, well, I don't really want to think about retirement because I'm too young. And it was almost like a horrible thought to have to think about growing old that I didn't want to consider at the time. And it seemed so long away that I didn't feel I needed to think about it. I only really started paying into a pension when I was 31. So I could have had a 10-year payment that I didn't have. And I think I've never thought about my pension. I don't even like opening the envelope when it arrives. It's so boring. I pass it on to my husband, which is terrible. Why should he have to deal with it? But I just don't want to read it. It doesn't speak to me. The way that it comes in its folder, the language it uses, the design of the way it's put together doesn't speak to me. I feel it's still so male-centric and so dry that it's just not something that excites me at all. And I think since I've had children, I really have started to think about the future more, like I want to give them something in the future. I want to make sure that they have some money to maybe buy a property in the future. All the things that I didn't have, I want to make sure that they do have. So I'm certainly thinking about the future in savings and pensions much more than I ever used to. I also don't want to be a burden on my children. I don't want to get to pensionable age and like go with a begging pot and go, here, help me. I don't want to have to do that. So having children has definitely shifted my perception of what future savings and the importance of doing it, both for myself and for my kids.
And Ellie, do you think that having children puts women at a particular disadvantage when it comes to pensions?
So, I mean, I've got a fly in my eye. The biggest kind of amount of, or the biggest cause of the gender pensions gap is part-time working. And it's mainly women, you won't be surprised to hear, that are actually doing the part-time work, and often low-paid part-time work. And so, you know, it has a big impact. It has a 3 million people impact, which is, again, like another kind of shocking statistic, because those women who are kind of low paid and part-time are just not meeting the threshold to be automatically enrolled. So you need to be earning £10,000 or more, and you need to be 22 or over, and they're just not meeting that. And we've spent a lot of time lobbying the government about various different policies that would make real change, and one of those is actually removing that £10,000 threshold. So that would bring in tons more women, you know, and men. So we're looking at, you know, 1.9 or nearly 2 million people actually coming into saving and workplace pension saving, if that was to happen, which I think would be amazing.
And is there anything else that we can do to encourage people to save into it, whether it's a workplace pension or setting up their own?
So, I mean, if you're in a workplace pension, you are kind of one of the lucky ones, I think, because, you know, you've got employer contributions, and there is a kind of minimum amount that you have to pay in. So your employer has to pay in 3% of your qualifying earnings, and you have to pay in 5% of your qualifying earnings, obviously totaling 8%. You have the option to opt out. You have the option to stop your contributions. But, you know, I'm, you know, speaking to everyone on this webinar now, please don't. You know, if you can save, then do save. Clearly, if you've got piles of debt with, you know, large interest loans, I think perhaps you should address those first. But, you know, my really strong kind of message to everyone is, as soon as you can start saving, then do, especially for women, as we've talked about. You know, if you're going to have children, whether it's, you know, 12 months mat leave or a career break, that is likely to impact your pension, and you need to think about that.
Absolutely. And I think that it can seem really tempting in the short term to save small amounts because you have so many expenses when you've got a new baby, but actually you're missing out not only on those contributions, but on the investment growth over years and years and years. And I think Deborah's experience of not paying into a pension when she was in her early 20s is quite typical, unfortunately. I think personally, when I started a job, I was living in London for the first time and could do with every penny I could save, and it was only my dad who said, you can't rely on the state pension, you've got to pay into a pension, that I stuck with it. But you know, not a lot of people are being kind of given that advice. And Helen, I wondered if there was sort of more to be done in just making sure that very sort of from a young age, when you are maybe just starting out with your first job, just getting the information out there and raising a bit of awareness about how important it is, and whether that's particularly the case for young women.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think with my sort of motherhood sort of hat on, definitely think about how the approach or how I feel about with my daughter is I'm really keen for sort of her to start planning her future, even though it can be quite incredible to think of when I look at a 9-year-old, and of course, even including pensions as early as possible, but also recognising the barriers at certain milestones that she'll come across with paying for higher education and buying a house, which, you know, is a challenge when she's trying to sort of prioritise her finances. But I think, you know, in terms of sort of teaching, you know, young people about the benefits of savings, the benefits of delayed gratification, being able to set financial goals, including right up and including what we were looking for in retirement. I have been quite concerned to see sort of the gender imbalance that I've seen in terms of students approaching financial education without any reason I've been able to put my finger on it. It still seems to be sort of a more male dominated subject. So it sort of echoes what we're seeing in terms of sort of women's experience and the sort of information about their pensions. But I definitely think, you know, the more that we can do to improve education at an earlier age and earlier stage would be helpful to the barriers that women face.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, what is really interesting as well about the gender pensions gap is it starts so early. You know, it's even apprentices, so young, you know, really young people, young apprentices, we're seeing a 6% difference between men and women, or, you know, the younger version of that. And then even before that, there was some research done by Kidzania. So, you know, the theme park where kids can do adult jobs, and they're seeing, this isn't quite the gender pay gap, but they're seeing kind of gender stereotypes in kids as young as 4 years old. So you've got women's jobs or girls' jobs and boys' jobs, and that kind of bias from that early age, which is obviously framed by their experiences they've had so far. You know, it's in their mind way before they're entering the workplace. But these are the types of things that we need to kind of educate about much earlier on, so that they don't then transpire to be, you know, causes of the gender pensions gap and gender pay gap later on in life. So I think, yeah, that was been quite interesting for me to sort of see how far back this actually tracks.
And Daisy, you especially went into the world of work probably younger than most, and is there any advice that you kind of wish you'd known when you started working?
Well, I think the funny thing, again, because I was asked to do this, I was thinking about me earning money. I earned a lot of money at a very young age. I left school at 17 to go full time, and I think that I definitely felt guilty for earning a lot more money than all of my peers at the time. So my way of, I guess, relinquishing that guilt was to just share it and spend it on everyone else and never save it. I mean, I think I was, you know, I definitely was very much at risk, because I just thought I was always going to earn like that, and there was absolutely no planning for what I wanted from the future. I mean, I was very lucky, and I was able to invest in property. I bought my first property at 21. So for me, even though I haven't pension yet, I guess that's my pension, I suppose, in bricks and mortar. And then it was only in the past few years, you know, I'm 31 now, and at 30 I was like, okay, I need to start investing in things like art, and, you know, as a way of having, you know, not just pissing all up the wall, essentially.
And how much of an influence has your grandmother been? Would you say she's the person that gives you financial advice, and what kind of advice does she give you?
Definitely, she's been a huge influence in all areas of my life. Any time I have to be responsible, she's the person I talk to. But she, you know, she was very keen for me to buy. You know, she was part of the driver of that, and just trying to saving for a rainy day. You know, I don't have kids yet, so I have got the luxury of kind of preparing before that, and I can't believe the gap as a result of being a woman. It's making me feel really sick from such a young age. But yeah, it's just about saving, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think speaking to family members really helps. A recent conversation with my mum, who worked in so many different careers. She was in construction and a chiropractor, a librarian, and she, despite having all of these jobs, she doesn't have a pension at all, and says it's all to do with childcare. And I feel like these sorts of issues aren't an older generation's issues. They are actually affecting young women today. And I wondered if somebody might be able to perhaps help Daisy out with some tips on setting up a pension, because we've spoken about workplace pensions, but not necessarily for young women who are self-employed. And we know that more and more people are going into self-employment as well. Helen, do you perhaps have some advice on where to start?
I think it's always an option. So, you know, young women who are self-employed could sort of actually maybe access sort of advice and, you know, sort of pension specialist advice if they didn't feel confident maybe looking into the options with regard to their own personal pensions and the sorts of investments they might. I think, like Deborah mentioned, you know, sometimes the information can be presented in quite a dry fashion. I remember having a meeting with a pensions advisor I had the opportunity to speak to through being a teacher, and actually being able to have that sort of person-to-person contact to be able to talk things through, and hopefully with sort of a greater rise in sort of use of social media, and like we were saying about being open to talk about money a little bit more, I think hopefully then, you know, I'd really encourage young women to sort of reach out and maybe thinking about this to find out what their options could be, given their unique employment status, to actually find out what might be attractive to them with the timescales and maybe the amounts that they've got, and sort of go from there really. If people don't feel confident about sort of going it alone and setting things up with some of the providers that can offer personal pensions.
Does it need to be expensive?
Sorry,
Getting this advice. Sorry.
So I was just going to say, I'm not allowed to give advice, but there are actually really great free websites out there. So the Money and Pension Service website, which I've also done a survey on this. So Daisy, as a self-employed person, there are options available. A personal pension, a self-invested personal pension. So there are options. As a self-employed person, you have to be more disciplined with your finances, as you'll know. I mean, as I said kind of earlier, when you're in a workplace pension, you're super lucky. You've got employer contributions, you've got tax breaks, and when you're self-employed, it's kind of taking control of your taking even more control of your finances, and getting that free advice, figuring out kind of which product would be good for you, and then being disciplined about saving.
Also, Ellie, lots of people don't necessarily know how much they should be saving into a pension, or even how to check how much is in it. So is there anything that you can suggest?
So so it's a tricky question, because it's kind of how long's a piece of string, really, isn't it? And I would say again, whatever you can, you should. There are sort of some basic rules of thumb. So some people say take your age and half it, but if you don't like percentages, which I don't, the PLSA has I think it was last year, produced retirement living standards. And so what that's done is enabled people to kind of visualize, which I think, Helen, you mentioned earlier that people can't really do, visualize the retirement that you want. So they've kind of looked at a basket of goods, and in that might be your regular household things that you need, and maybe a holiday or 2 holidays, and they've kind of carved it into basic living standards, moderate living standards, and comfortable living standards, and those all have yearly, what you would need yearly income on. So I would recommend that people go and have a look at that. It's retirementlivingstandards.org.uk, and I think that would really help people to kind of get that sense of, okay, this is what I want, and then you can almost work back to see how much you'd need to save in order to get there.
And Deborah, you mentioned that you kind of tend to chuck away the letters that you get from your pension company, or just to hand them over to your husband. I'm guilty of doing exactly the same, because I just want to deal with it another day. Is there anything that perhaps the industry could do to make it a bit more interesting, or just something that you would be more willing to engage with?
I'm interested in where pensions are invested, like what business, if it's industries that I'm interested in, I feel are doing good in the world, or have a specific resonance with me in some way, I'd be interested to know a little bit more about where the money is actually going. I was thinking of something else, actually. I think I remember being a kid and there being a lot of scamming around pensions. And I think as a 20-something-year-old, I think when they asked me, do you want a pension? I do think there was something in me that just thought, it doesn't feel like a safe thing to do. I think there's probably better ways to save, i.e. property, or I think at the time property, I just thought I want to buy a property. And for me, that felt like a safer option than a pension at the time. So I think I've never quite got over that, actually, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah, and I think also for lots of younger people, buying a property is their financial priority. And obviously that was the case for you, Daisy. Do you see property as perhaps a more of a safe and stable investment than a pension?
I mean, well, don't know now. But that's what I was certainly brought up to believe. I mean, my mum and grandma both always done up properties and sold them on and used it as kind of a sideline business, essentially. So I suppose that's what I was taught, was put your money into property. But I do feel like at the older I get, the more I think, oh, I really wish I'd thought about, like you were saying, ultimately packaged differently so that I'd love to know where my investments and my pension are going, and so that it was a bit more exciting as well, that you know that maybe you're investing in some positive stuff in the world, and then the return is you get your retirement. That sounds really interesting and something that I'd really want to spend in and be a part of almost. So it's not just like these blanket checks or direct debits going out of my account that I don't know. I've also tried to be really present and not want to think about, will I make it to 65? Or am I supposed to work till I'm 80? Or, my grandma's 80 and she's still running her own business and still working.
I think the language of pensions that you both touched on and making it a bit sexier is actually really important. And I think that really falls down to us in the industry to do something about. I mean, if you look at banking was boring and everyone stayed with their banks for 20 years and, never switched. Suddenly you've got a Monzo and a Revolut and, all these others. And pretty much overnight, it felt like there was that disruption in the industry. And, suddenly the £200 switching incentive was brilliant because you were going to these brands that are kind of doing something different, and pensions is kind of ripe for that. We've talked about millennials and Gen Z. They don't want bulky paper, and even the word pension, I've been thinking a lot about, is this the right word? If you just say it's a tax efficient, maybe not even tax efficient, but a long-term savings plan, or it's a tax efficient vehicle so that you get money when you stop working, just those kind of adjustments, I think, would just help demystify it and hopefully encourage people into thinking that pension's just as good as a property, better than a property.
Property seems to me just something more tangible, and I think more transparent. And just touching on what I was saying earlier, I think transparency and really women being able to understand exactly what is going on removes any fear or confusion, and I think transparency on all areas would be amazing, actually. Also someone to speak to women in the industry, to speak to women. I always think of pensions as men in suits, and again that just turns me off. So I think a female friendly environment, which is why I really like this conversation, actually, and why I'm happy to be here, is it's just more appealing. It makes me, I actually thought after this, I'm actually going to run upstairs and try and find all the information around my pension. This conversation has made me feel, oh, okay, I can do this. This is a conversation I can have and understand and be part of.
It's well worth doing, Deborah. It's really randomly spent the morning tracking down a couple of old pension pots.
That's what I'm going to do.
And just looked to see what they were invested in. Just because I think that young investors and young women in particular are really willing to be engaged with what they're invested in, and actually are much more conscientious about the companies they do and don't want to support. And I was really surprised to find some companies in an old pension that I hadn't ever looked at. There were some really kind of forward-looking companies like Apple and Microsoft and Google, but also British American Tobacco, BP, some oil companies that I perhaps wouldn't actively have chosen to invest in. And what I thought would be a really boring exercise was actually really fascinating. And one thing about self-employed workers like Daisy is that because they're setting up their pension themselves and actively deciding what to invest in, I think they almost have an advantage over employed workers who have it all done for them, because from the very first day they're becoming engaged in what they're investing in and can choose maybe household names that they're really interested in, maybe healthcare companies that are doing good, ethical investments. There's just so much choice out there, but I do agree that the world can be kind of full of jargon, and maybe that's where financial education comes into it, Helen. I'd be really interested to know kind of what's happening in schools at the moment, and how young women and girls are being taught these sorts of things.
Yeah, I think the compulsory aspect of financial education that has been introduced was a welcome step forward, but that is actually only part of the citizenship and personal, social and health education curriculum. So although it is a movement forward because it means that all secondary school students should get the subject touched upon, unfortunately it doesn't give the dedicated time to explore and develop financial concepts like we're talking about with investments and pensions with their long-term consequences. So I still think we're in a situation where there's not enough being done in schools right now to engage girls and young women to develop their wider financial education, to learn about these subjects in more depth. And I think one of the barriers is that there are many demands on curriculum time in schools. And while I believe it's a fascinating subject to teach and there are loads of fantastic resources available, the reluctance to discuss money that we've already talked about in wider society can also feed into maybe sort of a reluctance or a lack of confidence with teachers to teach it as a subject, because it is, although I'm always having conversations and I'm always challenging people on social media when they're saying, you know, why aren't schools teaching this? And I say, well, some of us are, you know, and some of us really want to see this going much more wider. Now, providing young people with a really good knowledge and understanding of their financial products and financial planning and some of the implications we've talked about, I think is mainly possible when they get the opportunity to study a dedicated standalone qualification in financial education. So actually, I'd like to see sort of more schools offering that opportunity to their students to be able to have curriculum time to study a standalone financial qualification, whether that's at GCSE level or as part of sixth form level, in line with other core subjects, because time and time again the students are telling me how they're going to use what they learn for the rest of their lives, and girls and young women value it for that reason. In terms of some of the barriers that we've got to this at present, I've written to the Department for Education over decisions that have been made that have had a detrimental effect on the levels of financial education that have offered within schools, because it can really vary based on how supportive senior leadership team are of the subject. I always promote the subject enthusiastically, really grateful for opportunities like this to raise it, and also carry out networking online, and also take part in events run by the Money and Pensions Service that we've mentioned. But I think there's so much more that needs to be done, and I'd really like to see more schools sort of embrace financial education and give the opportunities for the students out there.
And perhaps for parents as well to acknowledge that school isn't plugging the knowledge gap. I mean, Deborah, do you have any chats with your daughters or give them any advice about pensions, or do you feel it's a bit early for those sorts of conversations?
I think I need to educate myself before I educate them, to be honest with you. But, you know, I that's why I like being a working mum, because I think my children see me go to work every day, and when they say, oh, but mum, you know, you're not at the school, you're not picking up on the school playground, I can explain to them, I want to earn money, I want to pay for holidays, I want us to have a great lifestyle, and you know, two salaries are better than one, and I say that to them a lot, and they do understand the importance of it, and also having control over my own decisions. I say, you know, if I want to buy some nice shoes to my daughter, I don't have to ask daddy, I go and buy them myself. You know, it's that kind. So I'm already kind of sowing the seeds in their mind about the importance of having financial independence. And I think the other thing, it's not just learning about pensions at school. You know, my youngest is 5, they're pushing maths for women. They're really big on that conversation. It's a state primary school, and maths, they really encourage women to love maths. And if you ask either of my girls, maths is their favorite topic. One's 5, one's 8. So I think if you can break down the barriers of maths being a men's subject and the arts being a women's subject, which is how I was brought up. I liked maths, but if you ask me now, I always go, I've heard myself say in meetings, oh, don't ask me about numbers, I'm rubbish at those, I'm just a words person. I say it all the time, and that's because that's how I was brought up, whereas I don't feel my children will be brought up like that at all.
Yeah, and giving young women confidence from when they're 5 and 8 years old is just yeah, exactly what you need to do. And financial independence is one really important thing. Ellie, I also wondered if you had any other things something that we can do right now to address the gender pensions gap and drive change in the future.
Yeah, so before I talk, I'm going to caveat by saying this is no quick fix. You know, we've talked about kind of stereotypes from age 4 and that kind of thing, and it's not, sadly, there's no single bullet. The CII did some research, really great research on the gender pay gap, difference between what men and women get paid, and they were saying that actually the gender pay gap won't be closed to 2050, and actually pensions parity to 2100. So we are talking far away. But if those dates scare you, then this is why we've got to take action now. So there are things that we can do. If individuals that we've spoken about, women in particular, if you're going to be taking a career break, mat leave we spoke about, it's sort of time to take responsibility for that, and to kind of educate yourself about what's going to happen, or what may happen to your pension savings. And we also know that for individual women, you need to start saving between 5 and 7% more than men, to account for things like the career break. And actually, ladies, we live longer, so nearly 4 years longer even. Employers, my biggest thing for employers, and we haven't touched on it yet, is flexible working. So before COVID, it was only around 5% of employers offering flexible working. We're pretty much all doing it now. So the people that can are, clearly there's lots of industries where we can't flexibly work, but the ones where we can, remote working, reduced hours, all of those things are just brilliant to help get women back into work, to kind of manage what I'm calling the juggle struggle of having the kids, and actually not even just kids. Women are, as we said, carrying responsibilities later on in life, so it might be dropping off the shopping to your elderly parents, that kind of thing. So I think talking to your employer about flexible working and kind of trying to see what works for you and them is also key. And then lastly, the government. So if we're talking about what's the biggest change that we can do right now, government ministers, if you're listening to me, removing that £10,000 threshold that people need to meet in order to be automatically enrolled, just get rid of it, bring in 1.9 million people to pension saving, and the majority of them are women. There's also one more policy, which is removal of the lower band. I'm going to get it wrong now, but it's 6,240 or something like that. So if you remove that, that would increase total pension wealth by 140%. Bad news is, or good news if you're a man, that's going to be better for you, because in absolute terms, men tend to they're not working part-time and they're paid more, but actually the benefit to women represents a higher proportion of their projected pension wealth. So those two policies together would be absolutely phenomenal for helping us close this gap. And lastly, because I know I'm talking a lot, but clearly any policy options cost the government money. The government doesn't have a lot of money at the moment, as we know, but that's kind of no excuse, because we have a huge amount of people heading into retirement with no savings. Scottish Widows did a research piece last year, and it was 17%, with a further 22%, so 8 million, saying that they're not going to be able to retire at all. So for me, there's a bill to be paid. So it's just whether we kind of pay it now or whether we pay it in the future.
So no quick fix, unfortunately, but lots of opportunity for positive change. Thank you for all of those thoughts, Ellie. And thanks everyone for just sharing your fantastic personal experiences. And I certainly am going to have a chat with my friends about pensions next time I see them. And yeah, just get talking about it a bit more. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking part.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to check with Rick. Am I back in the room now? Okay. Do I need to leave would you like me to leave this meeting as well? That was awesome. Right. Thank you so much, everybody. I think you're all back in the room now. So we did a bit of a tech sleight of hand there. There was a Zoom meeting that we introduced, and then it was chaired by Kate Palmer, who is the senior money reporter for the Times and the Sunday Times, and she writes on the Modern Money column, and she's in particular has an interest in closing the gender pension gap. So Kate chaired. Then we had Helen Westwood, so she's the Moneywise 2019 Personal Finance Teacher of the Year. We had Deborah Joseph, Editor-in-Chief of Glamour magazine. We had Eleanor Levy, she's Director of Marketing and Comms at Now Pensions. And of course we had Daisy Lowe, who probably doesn't need too much of an explanation. We were thrilled to have Daisy. So we are pretty much there for Thursday. Thursday was the Now Pensions Takeover Day. Just want to say once again, thank you so much to Now Pensions for helping sponsor Pensions Awareness Live. Let's hear it from the people behind the camera once more. We're finished for the day. I'm going to pretty much wrap up here, but as you all know, and I'm just going to show you this. Oh, before I do show you this, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m, I hope you've logged on for Gaps, Pauses and COVID-19, a session by Kate Smith, Head of Pensions at Aegon. We've then got a pause for pensions at 11 o'clock with the Money and Pension Service. We've got Tax and Pensions with me at 1:30, and at 3 p.m. we've got a roundup of the entire week. So get involved still, get on board, love it, hug it, squeeze it. Your pension is still yours, it's still gorgeous, it's still lovely. See you tomorrow for more stuff. But before we go, I just wanted to show you that our schedule today, because the Now Pensions corporate colour is this piggy bank green, and you could see on our schedule of activity today, it is all green, then this made today a green day. So, I think I'm going to say cheerio. I think the people behind the camera are going to say cheerio. Give us a big shout goodbye. Take care, have a super evening, and see you tomorrow.